pawn e4, pawn c6, pawn d4, pawn d5, pawn e5, bishop f5, bishop e3, pawn e6, pawn c3, knight d7, knight d2, knight e7, pawn f4, queen b6, queen b3, pawn a5, queen takes b6, knight takes b6, pawn a4, pawn h5, knight g1, f3, pawn h4, bishop e2, bishop g4, knight g5, bishop f5, rook g1, knight g6, pawn g4, pawn takes g3, pawn takes g3, bishop e7, knight g5, f3, king d7, pawn b3, bishop g4, king f2, rook h3, bishop f1, rook h5, bishop d3, rook h3, knight f1, rook a8, h8, bishop d2, bishop takes f3, king takes f3, knight h4, king g4, knight f5, bishop takes f5, pawn takes f5, king takes f5, knight c8, king g4, pawn g6, pawn c4, bishop d8, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, pawn b4, bishop b6, rook b1, pawn f5, king f3, pawn takes b4, rook takes b4, king e6, pawn a5, bishop takes a5, rook takes b7, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, rook h8, h7, rook g1, b1, rook h1, knight b3, rook takes b7, knight c5, king f7, rook takes b7, knight e7, rook b6, rook a1, rook f6, King e8. Knight e6. King d7. Knight g7. King c8. Rook d6. Rook a7. Knight e6. Rook d7. Rook a6. Rook b7. King g2. Rook b2. King h3. Pawn e4. Pawn c6. Pawn d4. Pawn d5. Pawn e5. Bishop f5. Bishop e3. Pawn e6. Pawn c3. Queen b6. Queen b3. Knight d7. Knight d2. Pawn a5. Queen takes b6. Knight takes b6. Pawn a4. Pawn h5. Pawn f4. Pawn h4. Bishop f2. Knight e7. Knight g1 f3. Pawn h3. Pawn g3. Knight g8. Bishop e2. Knight h6. Knight h4. Bishop g4. Knight f1. Bishop takes e2. King takes e2. King d7. Knight e3. Knight c4. Knight takes c4. Pawn takes c4. Knight f3. Knight g4. Rook a2. Pawn b5. Rook h1 a1. Pawn b4. Rook d1. Pawn f5. Bishop g1. Bishop e7. Knight d2. Rook h8 b8. Knight takes c4. Pawn takes c3. Pawn takes c3. Bishop d8. Rook a2 a1. Rook b3. Rook d1 b1. Rook a8 b8. Rook takes b3. Rook takes b3. King d2. Rook b8. King c1. Rook b7. Rook b1. Rook takes b1. King takes b1. Bishop c7. Knight d2. Bishop b6. King b2. Bishop d8. King c2. King c7. King b3. King d7. King c4. Knight h6. King c5. Knight g8. Bishop f2. Pawn g6. Knight f3. Knight h6. Pawn c4. Bishop c7. Knight g5. Knight g4. Bishop g1. Knight h6. Knight h7. Bishop d8. Knight f8. King e7. King takes c6. King takes f8. King d7. Bishop b6. Pawn c5. Bishop a7. Pawn c6. Bishop b6. Pawn d5. Bishop takes g1. Pawn c7. Bishop takes h2. Pawn c8. King g7. Pawn takes e6. Bishop takes g3. Pawn e7. Pawn h2. Pawn e8. Pawn h1. Queen h8. King f7. Queen c8, f8. Pawn e4. Pawn c6. Pawn d4. Pawn d5. Pawn e5. Bishop f5. Bishop e3. Pawn e6. Pawn c3. Pawn c5. Bishop b5. Knight d7. Pawn takes c5. Knight e7. Knight f3. Knight c6. Pawn b4. Bishop e7. Castles kingside. Bishop g4. Bishop f4. Pawn a5. Bishop takes c6. Pawn takes c6. Knight b1, d2. Pawn takes b4. Pawn takes b4. Queen c7. Pawn h3. Bishop h5. Queen b3. Queen b7. Knight d4. Castles kingside. Pawn a4. Bishop g6. Rook f1, c1. Rook f8, b8. Queen c3, bishop f8, pawn b5, knight takes c5, knight takes c6, knight d3, knight takes b8, queen takes b8, bishop e3, bishop b4, queen c6, pawn d4, pawn b6, knight takes e5, queen c7, queen takes c7, pawn takes c7, rook c8, knight c4, knight takes c4, rook takes c4, bishop a5, bishop takes d4, king f8, rook a1, c1, bishop d3, rook c6, king e7, bishop c3, bishop takes c3, rook c6 takes c3, bishop e4, pawn a5, bishop b7, rook a1, king d6, pawn a6, bishop c6, rook takes c6, king takes c6, pawn a7, pawn e4, pawn c6, pawn d4, pawn d5, pawn e5, bishop f5, bishop e3, pawn e6, pawn c3, queen b6, queen b3, knight d7, knight d2, pawn f6, pawn f4, pawn g5, knight g1, f3, pawn takes f4, bishop takes f4, bishop h6, bishop takes h6, knight takes h6, pawn takes f6, knight takes f6, queen takes b6, pawn takes b6, pawn h3, knight f7, bishop e2, pawn h5, castles kingside, rook g8, knight h4, knight d6, king h2, king e7, rook f4, pawn c5, knight d2, f3, bishop e4, knight e5, rook g7, rook a1, f1, knight f5, Knight e5, g6, king d7, bishop f3, bishop takes f3, rook f4 takes f3, rook takes a2, knight f8, king c6, knight takes e6, knight takes h4, knight takes g7, knight takes f3, rook takes f3, knight e4, knight takes h5, rook takes b2, knight f4, pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, rook b4, pawn h4, rook takes d4, pawn h5, knight g5, rook f1, pawn b5, pawn h6, king d6, king g3, king e5, knight g6, king e6, rook f8, knight e4, king h2, knight g5, knight f4, king e7, rook f5, knight h7, pawn g4, pawn b4, pawn g5, pawn b3, pawn g6, pawn b2, rook f7, king d6, pawn g7, rook d2, knight g2, rook takes g2, king takes g2, pawn b1, pawn g8, queen e4, rook f3, queen e2, rook f2, queen e4, king h2, king c5, queen g3, king c6, queen f4, queen g6, rook f1, queen c2, king g3, queen g6, king h4, pawn d4, queen f3, king b6, queen b3, king a7, queen a2, king b8, queen h2, king a7, queen f4, queen c2, queen takes d4, king a6, rook a1, king b5, Queen d5, King b6, Queen d8, King b5, Rook a5, King b4, Queen b6, King c3, Rook c5, Pawn e4, Pawn c6, Pawn d4, Pawn d5, Pawn e5, Bishop f5, Bishop e3, Pawn e6, Pawn c3, Queen b6, Queen b3, Knight d7, Knight d2, Pawn c5, Queen takes b6, Pawn takes b6, Bishop b5, Knight e7, Pawn takes c5, Pawn takes c5, Bishop takes c5, Rook a5, Bishop takes d7, King takes d7, Knight b3, Rook a8, Knight f3, Knight c6, Bishop takes f8, Rook h8 takes f8, Knight f3, d4, Knight takes e5, Knight takes f5, Pawn takes f5, Castles queenside, King d6, King b1, Rook f8, e8, Rook d4, Knight c6, Rook d2, Rook a4, Pawn f3, Rook e5, Knight c1, Pawn f4, Pawn b3, Rook a5, Pawn h4, Rook f5, Knight e2, Pawn h6, Pawn h5, Knight d8, Pawn c4, Knight e6, Rook h1, d1, Rook takes h5, King b2, Rook a6, Pawn b4, Rook e5, Rook takes d5, Rook takes d5, Rook takes d5, King e7, Rook b5, Rook a7, Pawn a4, Knight c7, Rook e5, King d6, Rook f5, King e7, Pawn a5, pawn g5, knight c3, rook a8, rook c5, king d8, knight e4, rook a6, rook f5, king e7, rook e5, rook e6, rook c5, king d8, rook f5, king e7, pawn b5, rook g6, pawn b6, knight a8, pawn c5, pawn h5, pawn a6, pawn takes a6, rook e5, king d7, pawn b7, rook g8, knight f6, king c6, knight takes g8, king takes b7, rook takes g5,